Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
All right, welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Michael Ganato.
What's up?
And Raymond Perrier. So, last time we were talking
What's
about...
up?
Long delay. Last time we were talking about free will versus determinism, and so we wanted to continue that conversation today. So I'm going to kick it over to Raymond. He had some questions derived from our last conversation, and so we're going to just get the ball rolling that way. Raymond?
Cool. All right, so at the end of the last episode, I took down a couple of notes about where everybody stood on this, just to keep track of it, but also came up with some line of questions to kind of explore this further. So let's kind of go back and talk about where everybody stood. I know Michael has been chomping at the bit to destroy the free will side of things because he's an evil, maniacal human being. But no, let's get back into it. So we kind of left off with Jared basically saying that he was a Kantian, which for those who aren't in our world, that means that freedom is an important concept for the practical way that we live life. It ends up with this idea that freedom and determinism are basically compatible theories, and let's just start there and explore that. So let's explore what it means to have a practical postulate of freedom. Let's start there.
Well, by a practical postulate, the practical postulate of reason is basically a concept which is useful in terms of explaining other concepts. And this is especially important when you're dealing with, say, metaphysical claims which undergird some set of problems. So it becomes a foundational assumption which is made, which is itself difficult to establish. I think another good concept in this way would be something like personhood. So it's difficult to establish what we would mean by personhood, but it's something that we kind of presume in terms of autonomous agents in the world. Like we grant personhood or assume personhood for fellow human beings, and we don't typically extend that to, say, cockroaches, for example. Now, why don't we do that? Well, you could problematize it, but ultimately it's an important concept for morality. It helps ground morality. So it's really more than anything else a practical affair. And freedom is a similar idea, I think. What I mean by that is if you reject the notion of freedom, first off, you can't really establish it. It's taking another position on a indeterminable claim. And I think that in rejecting the notion of freedom, that gets you into a lot of other quagmires, right? So then you have to explain what's meaningful about ethical responsibilities. If this is your idea of rejecting freedom, that we have absolutely no choice, that everything in the universe has been predetermined for us, then how then can you expect to hold people accountable for their actions? Accountability kind of goes out the window.
Yeah. So let's pause there for a second because you said something very interesting that I think we should kind of explain. So one of the things is that what does it mean that why is it important that freedom is indeterminable or indemonstrable? I mean, not only that it's indemonstrable, but in a negative way, but in a positive way that has, I think, a powerful meaning in that kind of moral position.
I mean, you could say this about a lot of different concepts, which are especially grounding or foundational concepts. They're the things that we build a lot of other concepts on, but ultimately they are themselves very difficult to establish. So in another domain, it's you could think of it like this. I mean, just this is just an analogy. Something like physics is built on the foundation of mathematics. If mathematics is irrational, then physics, as a concept built upon mathematics, also becomes irrational, right? So you are assuming the grounding principle of the operations of mathematics in order to establish a secondary principle like physics. So if you're a physicist, to my mind, it wouldn't make much sense to undermine philosophy. It wouldn't make much sense to undermine mathematics in the same way that if you're a philosopher and you're dealing with concepts.
Is it? I don't know if I accept that.
What?
What?
What'd you say, Mike?
Oh, I wasn't saying anything.
It sounded like an interjection. I just stopped cold. No,
I mean, I disagree with like everything you said, but okay.
well, that's no different than any other time. Even if you didn't, you would still say that you do. So I think that it's important. You have to have some sort of foundation on which to build other things, because if you reject all foundations, then, I mean, that's fine, I guess, but then you can't really establish anything else. You're kind of left in silence.
At the end of your discussion about this in the previous episode, you sort of briefly mentioned that you're left with a compatibilist theory of freedom. Now, this is a compatibility is an idea between that's used to describe the relationship between concepts of freedom or free will and concepts of determinism. So, explain a little bit what a compatibilist theory of freedom would mean.
Freedom, and well, freedom, at least in terms of human agency, is compatible with a concept like the deterministic nature of the universe. So basically, there is some determinism within the operations of nature. If you push a rock down a hill, or for that matter, if you push a human down a hill, right, they don't have much choice in rolling down the hill. But if a human being has a limited range of options, right? Human beings do not have perfect freedom. They don't have absolute freedom, but they can choose within a limited range of options. And that choice means that we presume that human beings have some sort of autonomy, that they can have some governance over their behavior to greater or lesser degree, right? And that this means that human beings, or even perhaps other higher order mammals, for example, have a greater autonomy than inanimate objects. That agency is a feature of nature which operates differently than strict necessity that you find in inanimate objects.
So, Mike, at the end of the last episode, made the claim that there are different types of determinism and wanted to specifically talk about determinism through technology and how that had a bearing on this particular conversation. And then wanted to talk about why free will and ideas about human will are antiquated. But we'll leave that as like a conclusion and just kind of talk about what do you mean by different types of determinism and what is determinism through technology.
I can't even tell you what I had for breakfast.
You were determined to say them.
Yeah, probably. Right. I just say things most of
Well,
the time.
that's what you get. You've been hassling, you've been throwing up text messages on my phone all week about how you're going to trash free
I
will.
have,
So
I have.
let's hear your determinism discussion,
It's
buddy.
well, that was a bit of an over exaggeration. Just how like fighters hype up fights. I was just trying to hype up
Oh
the
yeah,
podcast, just to like play some mind
yeah.
games with you, get you thrown off a bit, so you make some kind of stupid claim. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Well, first and foremost, I don't really have a background in any of this shit, so nothing I say probably matters. But um, I guess I just approach this in a fundamentally different way. Um, because when I talk about, well, let me break it down. Um, so I yeah, I do think that the 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 discussion about freedom versus determinism, I think it changes depending upon what framework we're having for the discussion. So, for example, modern physics is highly deterministic. If you're talking about the laws of nature and how things in the universe operate, it's highly deterministic. And because it's so deterministic, it's highly successful in predicting, future events or the future state of affairs or whatever. But once you start moving into the realm of biology and psychology, I think the clear distinctions between determinism and free will start to break down. Mainly because I don't think if I say that something's physically determined, like within physics, if I say something's physically determined, I would put that in a different category as biological determinism. Because I think biological determinism is a little more indeterminate, if I can put those two together. So what I mean, so first of all, since we are biological organisms, I mean, I think any discussion that we have of free will and or determinism, I think you have to talk about it within a biological context. So in that sense, I mean, honestly, I would be a compatibilist because I think it's a both and type thing. There are biological factors which play a huge influence on our life, whether we're conscious of those things or not. That's undeniable. The time period in which we were born, how old we are, our situation growing up, our developmental cycle as a child, whether or not both parents were in their home, how early we were exposed to certain things. All of those have a strong pull on people's lives and the genes that we inherited. Things like alcoholism. And I think alcoholism is a good example. So if somebody has a gene, if their father or mother was an alcoholic and their father and mother was an alcoholic, most likely that person has the alcoholic gene. Now, is that person going to be an alcoholic? Well, you can't, maybe, right? You can't say yes or no. Probably, though. Probably. But that goes back to the whole nature versus nurture discussion. I mean, if the person grows up on an island in which there isn't any alcohol, then of course they're not going to become an alcoholic. But so once you, but at the same time, kind of what I object to, and let me clarify. So that I don't have a problem with. Compatibilism in some form or another, I'm probably a compatibilist if you pressed me. What bothers me uh, is the is the theological leftovers of free will. Because especially when philosophers talk about free will, they talk about it in a way that makes it a thing. That humans possess free will. Okay, well, what the hell does that mean? Like, is there a free will part of our brain? Like, is free will a faculty that human beings have? Like, that's where it starts to get weird for me. And oftentimes, free will is associated with the soul, right? So I just feel like there's a lot of metaphysical baggage that is brought in once philosophers start talking about free will within a biological context. So I'm really hesitant to use the language like the language of will. Like, what is a will? Right? That starts to get like really vague and people aren't really specific about what exactly they're talking about. But if you want to define like free will as our ability to act in a certain manner, like within our biological environment, I'm fine with that. But once you start abstracting the idea of will, that's where it becomes woo-hooey to me.
Yeah. What do you mean by abstracting from the will?
Well, I don't think you can talk about. Well, people. First of all, first and foremost, uh, people like to treat free will as something that makes us special, something that makes us stand apart, and as a result, something that is distinctive to humanity. And so my question would be like, what exactly what do you mean there? Like, what is this free will? Right? Because if you're talking about consciousness, consciousness is not distinctive to humanity. A lot of things are conscious, and not just higher order mammals. A lot of different things on this planet are conscious. So do those things also possess free will? Right? So that's kind of the line of thinking that my that I kind of go down.
Would you be more accepting if it was treated as if there were degrees of freedom of the will, in the same way that you would say there are degrees of consciousness because there are degrees of rationality?
Yeah, it's so long as you're not like, honestly, I'm not sure what. Okay, so honestly, I'm not sure what the distinction between like a free will and consciousness is, if you're just talking about like our ability to make decisions. But yes, I mean, I think you have to talk about consciousness. Consciousness exists on a spectrum, right? I would say some animals are more conscious than others in that respect. So, like, if you want to conflate free will and consciousness, yeah, that's cool. But if you want to make free will something like different than consciousness, that's where I'll have to start asking questions. That's where I have a problem.
Well, free will is perhaps just a an aspect, or not free will. Free is a qualification of the will, right? So even going back to, ancient times, it was understood that you had an intellect, you had a will, um, and the freedom of your will, whether or not it was free, was dependent upon your use of your, intellect or your gifts or whatever it might be. Over and above, like we talked about last time, your desires and passions that are more what they would call natural. So consciousness, and my understanding of the term from the early modern period, would simply be a more another term for mind, that's a little bit more nuanced in expressing the activity of existence, right?
Yeah, I don't like mind either.
Yeah, mind is less dynamic. It's just you can have a mind and it can be lifeless, but the implication of consciousness is that it's activity, it's existence, right? It's more existential. Um, so it's being, right?
Well, this feels like it goes back to Descartes, right? So this whole grounding of the thing which thinks as being a thinking thing, right? So what we have access to is this activity, this self-awareness. But what is it that knows itself? And Descartes makes it this, this cognitans, this thinking thing. Well, the thingness of it is what's been metaphysically problematic, right?
Yeah.
That we're aware of this activity, this self-awareness of this activity. It's this thought reflecting upon itself, but how do you ground that activity? And the tendency, going back to Descartes, has been to ground it in a substantial reality, to say that mind is a substance, and then to make it metaphysically distinct from materia, right? So this Cartesian dualism is this mind body distinction.
Which is horseshit.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people would see this as deeply problematic today, for one reason or another. Right? There's a lot of different ways in which you can problematize this feature of modernity, but a lot of modernity is foundationally built upon this Cartesian conception, right? That the mental is some kind of substance, and I think this is getting at what Mike's criticism is that we don't have access to anything
Yeah.
substantial in this way. Indeed, this is a long criticism of this notion. And so the idea of the will, what I hear Mike saying, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's fine if this is somehow a description of an activity, but when it becomes a faculty in a substance and it becomes this abstract metaphysical entity, then that's when it becomes inaccessible in terms of reasoning, and it becomes highly questionable in terms of its
Right.
existence.
But we can talk about and I'll use these words and hopefully we can dissect them a little bit with the context. But an ontological understanding of the free will, where it's not substantial and it is dependent upon an observation of the empirical and trying to describe or explain in logical terms, in just conceptual terms, what these entail or what these mean about being human, right? What makes our particular activities of being human unique to us, and what is, how do we explain that on, in a more universal way? And that doesn't have to be metaphysical.
Yeah, but I also have a problem with that language there of uniqueness, because I'm not sure how or why it's unique to us.
Because we killed all of our nearest evolutionary cousins.
No,
That's what.
seriously,
That's
like
why.
how is our free will different from free will
It's
of
not a question of it being unique to us. It's a question that a lot of the activities that we are, looking at, that humans participate in, are unique to us. At least they have a uniqueness to us.
Freedom, right? Not that there's an activity which is determinate in terms of its scope of identifying options relative to a range of options. But instead, is there this object which is defined by its freedom, namely the will? And what I think that, again, what it feels like Mike is attempting to problematize here, and I at least preliminarily, I agree with him, is that this is, this seems questionable, right, on metaphysical grounds.
what?
The idea of a substantial abstracted will apart from its activity, right, or at least its knowability. So maybe such a thing exists, but it's
Yeah.
phenomenologically unavailable to us, right? So this is
Yeah. Or just it's not available to science. Nobody's discovered this chunk of the brain that's like, oh, this is where the
yeah,
will is.
and so this is no. This is a Husserl. So like Husserl, and then later on someone like Jose Ortega y Gasset. The phenomenologist tradition in philosophy, in continental philosophy, has more or less bracketed out this notion, and it's like, no, what we have access to is the activity, right? We don't have access to this object, and so the whole Cartesian grounding for this is it has to be bracketed out. It has to be kind of set aside because we can't say anything meaningful about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you probably did a better job of explaining my position than I did, but that's
Thank you.
So, Mike, let's take a side path real quick and talk about determinism through technology.
sure.
Let's dive into
Okay.
that because when we're talking about a concept of freedom in this context for the both of you, we're talking about basically a compatibilist position, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about a concept of freedom in perhaps calling it political freedom, perhaps calling it agency, the ability to make choice within a limited set of options or circumstances, but purely empirical, purely based on grantings of the law, stuff like that. So how does that fit into determinism um, in itself, and how are we determined through technology?
Yeah, that's probably something I was just kind of talking out my ass in the last episode, but I think it's it's really interesting because I mean, I think my general point was like, depending upon what we're talking about, if we're talking about physics, if we're talking about biology, if we're talking about philosophy, this conversation is going to take a different shape. And, the compatibilist tradition that I probably take, I don't know, this may not be a compatibilist position, but one of the issues to kind of maybe play a little devil's advocate and to talk about the power of determinism, right? So you have physical determinism within physics. Basically, determinism is the kind of default position. I mean, you get indeterminacy in modern 20th century physics with like Gödel's incompleteness theorem and also with quantum mechanics. Um, But
And that's been a recent,
yeah,
sort of like development, but also like what a lot of free will advocates will say is like a sign of the possibility of describing the free will, right?
right.
However vague the conclusions and the premises of that argument are, that's people are excited about that stuff.
No, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Quantum indeterminacy would
Yeah,
allow
and
for the possibility of a free will, even with the obviousness of determinism.
Something like quantum indeterminacy is somehow evidence of a free will.
yeah, and that I don't. That would take a whole lot of explaining to get through my thick skull, but that I would have to have them actually break that down for me. So what I was thinking about with introducing the idea of technological determinacy is to say that this conversation, yeah, it's a fundamental part of philosophy, and historically it always has been. But there's new areas in which I think you get some interesting outcomes. So, just to briefly state it, I can just use this as an example. We'll probably come back to the philosophy of technology at some point. Um, but there's a French, I don't know if he was a philosopher. I think he was like an anthropologist or something, Jacques Ellul, who wrote a book called The Technological Society, and which is pretty accessible if you're interested in that. So he presents a form of determinism of human determinism, right? So you have like physical determinism, which we talked about, and then so moving into the biological, moving into humanity. His general argument is that we've progressed to a stage in human development in which we've taken a step that we can't go back from. That we've crossed a point of no return in terms of the development of technology, and that this road is leading to some predictable outcomes. So for me, regardless of the merits of Ellul's idea, I mean, there is the whole debate between free will and determinism in areas like history. Some 19th century examples of that would be, of course, Karl Marx and Hegel. They had deterministic views of history, but I was just I guess I was making that point in order to point out that this is a recent conversation as well, in more contemporary fields of philosophy, like the philosophy of technology, like are we technologically determined, and in what sense does freedom or free will come into play within that context. I think I was bringing it up more as an example. I was probably just thinking about it at the time. We don't necessarily have to go down that route, but that's just kind of my rationale for bringing it up.
Well, this might be a weird thing to bring up, but I was rereading. Well, it's not really that weird. I was rereading C.S. Lewis's. I guess it started it was a series of lectures, "The Abolition of Man." You guys familiar with that?
I'm not, no.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, "The Abolition of Man" is an interesting work because he starts out criticizing basically this undermining of a certain kind of objectivity. And what his conclusion is by the third, so it's three different lectures. And I won't go through all of it, but in the third lecture, the one which is the aforementioned title, Abolition of Man, he talks about how this human project of the domination of nature, he sees it as eventually when human beings have reached the stage that we are currently at in modernity, where we have almost total dominance of nature. So the last aspect of nature to which we are left to conquer is basically human nature, and that we become, in the same way in which we have bent the rest of nature to human desires, human will, and human needs, that human beings of the present will eventually start to bend human beings of the future, right? So they will actually destroy the freedom of the future through technological innovation. Basically, that we will decide for all time what is best for human beings and what sort of human. Basically, is kind of putting a bit in the mouth of the evolutionary process, and he thinks that this will be ruinous,
Yeah.
such that the man mankind in its last stage will be the least free, because we will have basically turned the weapon of technology that we use to conquer nature, will turn it back in on ourselves.
That's a really good point.
Which I think it's an interesting essay, and I would encourage anyone to read it, to reread it, and to think about the argument. This may also be an interesting place to transition the conversation, unless you have some other pressing questions, Raymond, to a discussion of something about like political
Can I
freedom.
just add something real quick to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I sort of remember why I brought this up in the first place. So to me, like, moving aside from the metaphysical question surrounding free will or the will or whatever, that's not terribly interesting to me, because I just don't understand it, and I don't think that it has a place in modern discourse. But the reason why I was bringing up technological determinism, because the question of freedom and the question of how free are we, I think, is a really good question, especially in light of what Jared and I were just talking about. So, like, within that sense, like, if you want to talk about like freedom in terms of like avoidance, or freedom in terms of, because the basic assumption, and Raymond, feel free to jump all over this if you want to, but I feel like when I talk about this with people who aren't very well versed in philosophy, who don't have a background in it, I mean, I think people's default position is that we are free, right? I mean, the everyday Joe Blow on the street, yeah, I think that most people are like, of course we're free, right? I can do whatever I want to. But I think the purpose of Lewis's essays, and certainly the purpose of Ellul's technological society, is maybe we are not free as we thought we were, and maybe we should think about why that is the case. That's all I wanted to add.
Well, I was gonna say before we jump into that, because my position was to defend free will, and it's fairly easy. I'll put it. No, I can't do it. It's impossible.
It's
It's
fairly easy, but
Go
it's
ahead.
impossible.
it's so damn antiquated. It's so damn antiquated. No, I this is what it boils down to, and I've given it great consideration this week. You can't do it anymore unless you entirely discount every other scientific discipline that has basically jumped into studies about consciousness, mind, brain, neurology, where now if you talk about the human mind, it's really just a synonym for the brain. Now, when
Yeah.
you talk about consciousness, it's really just a synonym for, existence, for life, thinking things that, are aware, not even self-aware, just aware, right? Just existing. And free will is really, it's basically just a religious concept now. That's
Hmm.
the only place that I think it really fits in, or it fits in with people who are willing to just say, I don't care about, neurology or biology or any of that stuff, and I'll just continue to live like moderns and, have faculty psychology and metaphysical concepts of free will.
So, Raymond, would you say that that the idea of free will has now, gone into the realm of natural philosophy? That what was once a problem for early modern philosophers has now sort of been like assumed and changed form by various other
Yeah,
sciences?
I mean, well, I think it happened within natural philosophy. I think the realization was that we can talk about freedom without having a faculty psychology. We can talk about rationality without saying
Okay.
that there's an intellect that's trying to overcome the passions. I mean, you still have these words and these terms in there, but the meanings of them change. Like rationality becomes sort of an orientation, right? It's an attitude, more than it is,
Yeah.
like something substantial, some substantial faculty, which allows you to talk about it in degrees, right? It allows you to say that there are
Yeah.
smarter people, who may be smarter because, the way that their frame of mind is, their orientation and thinking, their attitude, and all these other factors in biology and neurology that could play a part in that. And then, there are people who have, lower levels of rationality in a measurable scale, and that's just the reality of human existence and existence in general for anything that has some kind of rationality, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think the sciences the way that they are now were the underlying factors of transforming that. I think it happened maybe within 100 years after, Descartes wrote his Meditations, if not sooner.
Oh, okay.
You know,
With like, can you point to like a couple of people? Like, because I'm interested. I think some other people might be interested.
yeah, I think the German idealists were the first ones to step beyond it to say we don't
Huh.
need to talk about free will. We can just talk about freedom. Like you were saying a moment ago, the feeling of freedom, right?
Yeah.
That's a term widely used by Schelling. It's a term widely used by Schleiermacher. So this idea that we don't need to talk about a free will to make freedom a substantial and meaningful concept, right? It's just not important. And so they did it from ontological bases, which may be more suspect to people nowadays. But yeah, it wasn't something I think that was very needed for them. They just didn't need to talk about it.
Well, I think that a counterpoint to that would be someone like Schopenhauer, right? And then, of course, perhaps early Nietzsche, who did stress an emphasis on the will, but you would have to define in what sense they have a meaning of the will, right? Um, so, but they retain that language, however defined or constituted. They at least retain the language of the will.
Yeah, and Kant uses it too. And he's contemporary to Schelling and all. So I'm not saying that there weren't still people. There's still people here today that use free will, discuss. So it's not to say that it came out of existence. It's just to say that there were other voices who led in a different direction that kind of takes us where we are now, I think.
Well, I think that in terms of, again, transition here, because I want to spend, we got maybe 20 more minutes. I want to at least touch on the notion of liberty and, something like political freedom and whether or not that exists in society. Because it's one thing to talk about freedom in the abstract, and it's a very different thing, I believe, to talk about freedom in concrete terms. And so when you get into like political philosophy or contemporary discourses on the nature of freedom relative to people groups in different times and places, then it's important to make that distinction. So freedom as a concept versus freedom as something that is available to the human actor, the human agent. So I feel like Mike and I have been talking a lot here. So Raymond, you want to give us some initial thoughts?
So I think one of the big parts of the transition between free will to freedom, especially considering the undertones of the political understanding of liberty, which is at the forefront of the conversation, even in the modern period with people like Thomas Hobbes, who is notable for saying that, having like hyper determinism when he really didn't. He had a natural physical determinism and then had a concept of freedom that was very political, like liberty. There's Jean Jacques Rousseau as well, who's famous for that and who's probably the most impactful during that period on people like Immanuel Kant, Schelling, Hegel,
Don't
all
forget
of these
Locke.
thinkers, and Locke, yeah.
There's also the French, the events of the American, but really the French
The
Revolution.
French Revolution, yeah, yeah.
The spirit of the French Revolution was so very important. It did not have the same impact on thought that the French Revolution did. It just didn't.
Don't underplay the American Revolution, all right?
The American Revolution and
Yeah, but where is the French Revolution drawing inspiration from? Who were some of the primary thinkers that helped to influence French politicians at the time? Americans.
it still doesn't matter. Yeah, but you also got to think those Americans borrowed
Yeah, it
ideas from
does
people
matter.
like they borrowed ideas from John Locke, British,
Locke,
and
yeah.
they borrowed ideas from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, French. The
Mainly
point
Locke.
is that the event itself, and then the subsequent terror, and then after the terror, the dictatorship of Napoleon were really important. I mean, when Hegel talks about the world spirit, right? He has in mind, Napoleon as conqueror. So the shape and character of thought in the early 19th century is profoundly influenced by this. You can think of this in terms of Gottlieb Fichte as well. Fichte's writings about the nature of political freedom and those ideas. These are all.
Yeah. But
Go ahead. I was just going to say you can trace a direct line to the French Revolution.
But the historical aspect aside, what I think is more interesting is how they started talking about that. So let's jump into that. Like, what does freedom mean for them? So from like a sense of self perspective, like a selfhood perspective, basically instead of saying that human beings had faculties of the mind and then faculties of the body, right? Or faculties of the soul, which is the mind, right? And faculties of the body, which was the organic, natural, physical thing that we had, that we were, embodying. Um, it was more dynamic. It was more organic. They saw it more as, instead of us trying to conquer desires, this brutish nature that we were stuck with because of our body and because of the fall of humanity, via like Christianity and Judaism and whatnot. There was this real sense of trying to strike an accord or a harmony between one's desires and one's moral and rational principles, right? And so insofar as a human being can say, this is what I desire, and I can make these decisions based on these principles that I hold, dear and as a part of who I am, who's really keeping me from pursuing my freedom? It's not myself. It's our external factors, like the government, like the society, like, the religious politics, whatever it might be. So that's like the big catch point, I think, from moving from free will to a concept of freedom. Is it's sort of more of the external pressures than it is any sort of anthropological, you know, psychology that we're working against or fighting against. All that being said, just to spice this up a bit, I think compatibilism is weak sauce.
What?
Yes, absolutely. It's the most
Oh my God.
boring theory of freedom we could have possibly come up with. Well, it doesn't contradict determinism, so I guess that's okay. It has no nuance. It's just completely and utterly uninteresting.
Damn.
Existential freedom is way more interesting. This idea of like a feeling of freedom that all humans have, or that we want to say all humans have. That's way more interesting.
Well, you better at least back up your critique or go into an explanation of existential freedom if you're just going to throw out bombs like that.
No, that's it. That's all I've got. You can just
It's all a bunch of
no.
malarkey.
So
Moving on.
so the difficulty with a concept of freedom is still what we find with Jared's tendency to talk about Kantian freedom, right? You can't demonstrate freedom, right? When you start to say, this is why I made my decision, you just lay out all of these factors that from a deterministic perspective are the reasons why you did it, because you were determined to do it.
Yeah.
A, B, C. You went from A to B to C because, X, Y, and Z made those, determinations for you. And then you're just living your life. So like a hyper form of determinism, right? And which is, we haven't talked about that, but that might be something interesting to take up on. But basically, existential freedom is basically just saying that the concept of freedom is inconsistent with a systematic whole. So when you look at the entirety of a circumstance or situation, a systematic whole, it is, you can, with the proper observation, the empirical data, with the proper scientific technology and equipment to make measurements and to observe um, whatever is happening, you should be able to account for every single moment and explain it basically down to its molecular particles, right? Pieces, like the very basis of existence itself. So, um, an existential sense of freedom would just say, that that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about freedom is the ability to explain human action or human choice. It's really just this sense or this feeling of freedom that becomes sort of a cornerstone of how we live our life and how we see existence.
Yeah, I think I definitely think there's merits to that. And that kind of reminds me, like, uh, I would probably frame this conversation, getting back to biology, I would probably frame it within the context of evolutionary biology in terms of like the root of this idea of freedom and exactly what you're talking about. I mean, it definitely possesses an evolutionary advantage, our ability to think on our toes and to make decisions at a split second. A brick's flying towards my head, I guess I should duck type thing. So like in a sense,
Yeah.
but at the same time, like we have been completely and utterly removed from that environment and from that context within modern industrial society. We no longer spend a majority of our time looking for food and trying to survive. Instead, we go to 9 to 5 jobs where we answer telephones or do whatever. But
I look at my food in the refrigerator a lot.
right,
A lot. Hours of the week spent looking at food in my refrigerator,
just staring at
just
it,
staring at it.
which is historically really new, and
Super, super new.
obviously,
Yeah.
yeah, but we still have. So, like, I kind of like picture it in that sense. Like, I think that if you want to explain the origins of this feeling, I mean, I think it makes sense, evolutionary speaking. But like many things that make sense, evolutionary speaking, like consciousness, like, what do we do with it now? Now that we have transcended our traditional boundaries of what used to confine us, like food and shelter and water, like then it almost does take on like an existential aspect, and Sartre kind of talks about this in Being and Nothingness, and also existentialism as a humanism. Um, he kind of goes into the fact that there is a large part of us that is biologically determined, societally determined. I mean, we're determined by our economic situation that we're born into. We're determined by our genetics, but at the same time, we have this ability to say like, no, I don't think I'm going to drink, or I'm going to go to college and get a middle class job, that sort of thing. So what makes sense to me is, I guess, more so focusing on the feeling of freedom that you were talking about. That's way more interesting for me, anyways.
Yeah, I think that.
I don't know what you would add to that. Or,
Well, I think the question that we could debate then, and maybe not in this episode, but in the next one we talk about the concept of freedom, maybe we can focus on the feeling of freedom and this idea of an existentialist understanding of freedom.
I disagree.
But yeah, no, go ahead, Jared. I was just
No. Well,
I felt like we were in a large agreement on this episode, Jared. It was kind of sexy.
oh, I really have nothing to say other than just a sheer refutation of everything, just a repudiation of everything that you all
That's
are saying.
surprising.
Yeah, yeah. We kind of ground to a halt because after we talked about it, we were like, we kind of agree.
let's scrap this episode. This is going to be boring as hell.
Well,
Yeah.
well, you brought up Elul,
Yeah, to your heart specifically.
which another interesting aspect relative to freedom with Elul is the fact that he's an anarchist, which is something near and dear to my heart, of course, as you all know. And so the idea of political anarchy is a really important. Why? Why is political anarchy near and dear? Because
Are you like stocking up on guns or something we don't know about?
He likes to read the Russians.
I do like to read the Russians. Well, we are all from the South,
He
so
inherited them.
it kind of goes. No, no. The thing with regards to freedom, in particular, like the anarchist notion of freedom, is just really it's not definitionally distinct from other forms or notions. It's just emphasis on the inherent distrust of centers of power, right? So any kind of concentration of power is inherently problematic. And so you have to justify, you should always have to question power, and power should always be on the defensive. Because if you ever just assume the legitimacy of power, then that's problematic. And so if your concern is political freedom, then you should always, I think, be questioning those who have social power, who have political power, their and what they do with their actions, right? What they do with their power. I find this extremely strange when
Right.
I'm teaching classes, is that there seems to be a foundational presumption that rich and powerful people got what they got because they all universally worked really hard and they deserve it, and that not only that they are somehow benevolent
Makes
in
you a
their
good
uses of
person,
power.
right?
Yeah. Being rich makes you a good person, and that you're rich because you're a good person, and that anything you choose to do with that wealth, right, that rich and powerful people have our best interests at heart. And the thing that I always want to question is, why would you think that that's the case? Why would you possibly think? It's not that it's necessarily the case that any person who has great wealth cannot be a good person. The problem is, what incentive do they have? There's a lot of social incentives which go out the door in terms of caring for others. They're just not necessarily there for very powerful people. And so the standard for conduct in a society obviously should not be people who are the most powerful, I think. And so when it comes to freedom, we also have to think about freedom from what, freedom to do what, right? Because rights language sometimes means, the trampling of other people. Well, it's my right to do X. I'm free to do X, no matter whom it hurts, right? And I think that that sort of freedom is quite problematic as well, right? Because it doesn't take into account something like the harm principle, namely that your freedom to swing your fist stops where my nose begins, right? That constraints on freedom can be justified if it means preventing harm. Then you have to establish to what extent, right? But perhaps that is a conversation for another day. Any concluding thoughts on that?
You want to go first, Raymond?
Well, I was just gonna say it's interesting because in all of this, we've kind of settled on this idea of freedom as insofar as it's still connected to something like quote unquote uniquely human, which I know Michael doesn't
No, I
like
don't, because it's horseshit.
that turn of phrase. But yeah, thank you. But we can say that if we're talking about a feeling of freedom, it's really interesting because the feeling of freedom uh, necessitates some awareness of determinism. Almost like you can't actually have an understanding or even an ideal of freedom or free will or whatever without already presupposing an awareness of determinism. Because if we, and this is something that I think we should talk about, the extremes of freedom in the next episode when we talk about things like, like what would a maximum freedom look like? Like if God was free, what would that mean? Like absolute freedom, what would that mean? And if that's even intelligible or logical. Because if you, like Jared was saying, if you're not free from something or free to do something, which, assumes or presupposes some sort of, deterministic world or some sort of, law prohibiting things and allowing other things, then there is no real meaning to the word freedom at all. It's just, it doesn't make sense. You really can't talk about freedom without determinism.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I'm still trying to think about what Raymond just said, but we'll get to it in another episode. I don't know if I have any closing thoughts per se. I just kind of wanted to build off a little bit what Jared was saying, just to say that this idea of freedom, this problem of freedom that we've been kind of mulling over for the past episode or so. I mean, I think it's historically it's distinctly modern, and this is something. This is an idea. It's a concept that has come about very recently, beginning in the Enlightenment, and to me, it's almost inevitably linked with politics. So that's why I'm glad we're transitioning to talk about freedom as a concept, because I don't know. I just don't with ancient peoples and with medieval peoples. The assumption is that people in power are there for a reason, and that assumption is fundamentally undercutted during the American and the French Revolution with the idea of Rousseau's social contract theory, for example, which says no, the reason why they're in power is because we allow them to be in power. So their power is based not in God or some foreordained plan, but rather in the consent of the people. So
That's also ultimately Hobbes's point in the Leviathan, right? Is
yeah,
that the
that's exactly
Leviathan
right.
is basically society, right? I mean,
Right.
the king is the head, and we grant him a lot of power, but ultimately he only serves at the pleasure of the people, because he's there to serve the interests of the people. But that's something that we can talk about next time. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's exactly right.
And he's still a monarchist.
He is.
Yeah, no. He's defending the concept of
Yeah, he's still
monarchy,
a
but
monarchist.
ultimately the reason why he's defending the concept of monarchy is because he thinks that it's a more efficient system, ultimately, than a lot of other systems.
I was just bringing all that up just to say that I find it interesting that even though our basic default is to assume that we are free, that probably wasn't always the case. And that this idea of freedom is deeply linked with our current conceptions of government and our idea of political freedom that we'll get into.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. That's going to do it for us here at Front Porch Philosophers Podcast. As always, I'm Thomas Jared Farmer. Thank you for your time.
And Michael Granado here. Did Jared not say our names, or did he just?
Nobody wants to know who we are, Mike.
Oh my God!
I left it to you
He
guys.
just said good night.
You guys have autonomy. Right? You're free.
Michael
You're
Granado
free to
representing
speak.
the dirty
No.
South.
Oh my God. Why is it got? All right. Good night. Bye bye.
All right. That's it for us. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Oh man.